16. I'm going to go ahead and mute and just give me direction. Please provide me directions with the slides. Okay.
All right. Sounds great. Thank you so much, Ruby. Hi, everyone. My name is Tanya, and I'm here with Erica, Brittany, and Sachira. And today we're going to be discussing what it means to decolonize our diet. And our target population for this workshop series is Pacific Islander high school youth, but this topic can really apply to all of us. And so we ask that as we reflect together, that you may just come as yourselves and think about how this applies to you personally. Next slide, please. And so our workshop today is the first of a 6-week long after-school series for PI high school youth. And this introductory workshop really lays the foundation for the next 6 weeks, where we'll be introducing many of the themes that will be addressed in the upcoming workshops. And so some of those future topics include PI health, food systems and justice, cooking demonstrations, decolonizing our diet, and creating a DIY cookbook and recipe showcase. Next slide, please. But for today, we'll start with some foundations and share some snippets of what you may see in the future. So this is week 1, titled No History, No Self, but No History and No Self. And next slide. And some essential questions we're going to be reflecting on throughout are, what does eating healthy mean to me and my culture? And also, how would I redefine health? So I'm going to pass it on to Brittany to review our agenda.
Thanks, Tanya. So for today's agenda, we will be starting off with a food and mood journal activity with me. And then next, we're going to learn about the PI diet and health outcomes with Serene Sachira. And then we're going to discuss BMI and its influence on diet and health with our energetic Erica. And then we're all going to, absorb this new knowledge. We're going to digest and then partake in our food for thought discussion in our breakout rooms. And then lastly, we're going to come back together, close it off with a debrief and a reflection with our talented Tanya. So if you move on to the next slide. Thank you. So now we're going to segue to our first part of the agenda, which is our food and mood journal. So what we'll all like you for all to do is to grab a piece of paper and pen, or a laptop if you do have that, to write down for 10 minutes with these amazing prompts that we have for you. And this is what we're going to do every day when we meet together, is have our first 10 minutes on a food and mood journal time. So these are the questions that we have for each and every one of you all to answer. So the first one is, what kind of food do you eat with your family, with your friends? Where do you get your food? How does the food make you feel? And then what influenced you to eat the way you eat? So we're going to take some 10 minutes for you all to write, reflect, and just a disclaimer too as well, we won't be reporting back and sharing this, only because we want to give you all time to really reflect, but we'll hold some space later in our breakout rooms if you do wish to share, but want to let you all know that we won't be sharing after our 10 minutes of writing. So without further ado, I'll let you all write, and I'll play a little bit some lo-fi beats for y'all to get into that writing jam session. Volume good? All right, it is 5:30. So we're gonna wrap things up. Hopefully y'all got the chance to really reflect and write down, what resonated or made you think of when answering these questions. So if you can move on to the next slide. We'll now transition to our wonderful Serene Sachira to talk about our overview of PI diet and health outcomes. So I'll hand it over to Sachira now.
Thank you, Brittany. If you can go to the next slide, please. These are some of the terms that I'll be going over with you all today. Obesity is the first one. It's measured through an individual's BMI, which is body mass index, and any individual with a BMI of 30 kilograms per meter square is considered obese, which means they have an excess of body fat. Obesity increases the chances that an individual will suffer from various medical conditions like heart disease and diabetes. BMI stands for body mass index. It's calculated by dividing your mass in kilograms by your height in meters squared. BMI has a range with 30 and above making the individual obese. Heart disease, it's also called cardiovascular disease, and it's used to describe conditions that involve narrow or blocked blood vessels that can lead to heart attack or stroke. And the last one is diabetes. There's two types, type 1 and type 2, but for our lesson, we're going to just focus on type 2 because it's the results of an unhealthy diet. It's a condition that affects the way your body metabolizes sugar, also known as glucose. The body either resists the effects of insulin, which is a hormone that regulates the movement of sugar into your cells, or it doesn't produce enough insulin to maintain normal glucose levels. Losing weight, exercising, and eating well can help manage the disease because there's no cure for diabetes. You can go to the next slide, please. So this slide talks about obesity in the Pacific Islands. So obesity has risen to the top of the worldwide obesity scale in the Pacific Islands. It used to be thought that Pacific Islanders were predisposed to obesity because of genetic factors, but new studies indicate that it was the introduction of Western diets and foods when the islands were colonized that are the cause behind the obesity epidemic. The islands were colonized by Australian, American, New Zealand, and British nations, and the traditional island foods of fresh fish, meat, local fruit and vegetables were replaced by rice, sugar, flour, canned meat, canned fruit and vegetables, and soft drinks and beer. You can see American Samoa, the percent of obese is like 74.6%, which is quite a lot. Okay, you can move to the next slide, please. So the trends in the US. This chart shows the prevalence of obesity among Pacific Islander 5th, 7th, and 9th grade students in Los Angeles compared to other races. As you can see, Pacific Islander youth are more likely to be obese when compared to other races. Obesity has a strong association with adverse health conditions like heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. In 2014, Pacific Islanders were 3 times more likely to be obese than other Asian American populations in the US. And in 2016, they were 80% more likely to be obese than non-Hispanic whites. Some Samoans were 5.6 times more likely to be obese compared to other Asian American populations. And Pacific Islander subpopulations had higher obesity rates than both the Asian American and non-Hispanic white populations. Pacific Islander youth were twice as likely to be obese compared to non-Hispanic white youth in 2017. Many Pacific Islanders are also deficient in micronutrients, with 1/5 of children and pregnant women suffering from anemia. Trends in iodine deficiency have also been noted. These trends are attributed to the drastic change in diet culture in the Pacific Islands following the colonization of the islands. The drastic change in diet has been widely adopted by the Pacific Islander community worldwide, with adverse health conditions associated with the obesity that's affecting adults and youth. Okay, next slide, please. We're gonna take 5 minutes to do a Padlet to answer this question. Let me just pop that into the chat. So after hearing all of this information, which I know is a lot of information, how do you feel? Anything that comes to your mind, just type it in the Padlet. There you go. I'm seeing a lot of really, really interesting ideas from you all about body mass index being evil and it's a colonized tool. We are going to get more into that later on in our presentation. What else? It's a good question asking if BMI is an accurate measurement and if it's outdated. I don't really have an answer to that. I'd have to look into that for you guys. It's just kind of the widely accepted tool of measuring obesity trends or yeah, so I'm gonna hand it over to Erica. Actually, she's gonna go dive deeper into all of these ideas that you guys are talking about with BMI and the food trends and how it's impacted other communities. So Erica?
Yeah, thank you, Satira. That was a lot of information, and I really appreciate the feedback that you gave Padlet. I want to acknowledge that the data is and that we will dive deeper throughout the rest of the program into those topics and issues. We're also going to use this time for information that we were just presented as a foundation for our next discussion. And so it was great that a lot of you pretty much defined BMI as like a culprit in how we see health. And I think I already gave the answer away, but if you go to the next slide, please. My question to you is, an underlying factor that dictates someone's health outcomes. We already said it, but I just wanted to see.
Eric, is this the slide you want me to be on?
Yeah. It is, we already actually answered it in the Padlet, which is BMI. So just remember BMI as a common theme. My question now to all is, how does BMI influence your thoughts on health and following parents? Okay, so in the interest of time, we're going to speed through these, but we would technically have a lot more time to have a conversation on each term. But what we're going to identify first is Americanization, which is activities that were designed to prepare immigrants to act as the ideal U.S. citizen. And so if you have any questions, or if you have any, sorry, my audio is choppy. If you are gonna feel free to also type in your definition into the chat. And if you also agree or have some sort of reaction to it, please also leave the reactions, those emojis in the chat as well, okay? So Americanization, we already just defined it. Anyone have examples of what Americanization could look like? We have a image of it's almost, to me, it looks like it's training a person's belief system, like training. And so, bit of history here, there was a lot of programs that taught foreigners and immigrants to learn English and practice American history, and also become familiar with the governmental structure of the United States. And there is, sorry, my audio is bad here. Let me see. I'll try this. Is this better? Yeah, okay, cool. So there is an example of Americanization with YMCA, where they have programs to teach everyone English during the industrialization period. And then in the chat, I see that eating bread instead of rice, which is what I often hear from colleagues. Yep. Yeah. There's also the next term, assimilation, which is the process of taking in and fully understanding information or ideas. This can be either by choice or by force. And we have an image here of a puzzle. And what do puzzles do? They pretty much fit into each other to form a bigger picture. Oh yeah, I see spam. Oh, you guys are pretty much taking the point, which is awesome. And this example of assimilation is looking at lifestyle and how someone can adopt a slower paced lifestyle from moving to a new place or community that was a faster life pace. Share on everything. Yeah. Does anyone have any examples for assimilation? Don't see anything else in the chat. So we're going to go with the next term, which is diet culture. And diet culture was briefly mentioned by Sachira, and it is defined as a belief system that focuses on values, weight, shape, and size over well-being. And my question with this term is, what do you think of when you see or hear the word diet? That phobia. This icon that we have here on our presentation, it almost signifies like being without or watching what you eat with certain types of food. Yeah, diet is just kind of like a really harsh term. And so a little more information about diet culture and BMI. Have you ever thought about who created BMI? Like, how was it ever introduced? Yeah, so, okay, here's some really interesting facts. BMI was introduced by a Belgian mathematician who was not a physician, and this person's name was Adolphe Quetelet. Can't say his name. And it was used to basically further marginalize communities of color. So someone in the Padlet did mention that it was a colonizer tool. And yes, it does by patriarchy as well. So yeah, one question that we can have as food for thought is like, why do we buy into diet culture? Would anyone have any like examples of how diet culture can be present or presented?
Can you repeat the question?
How would you see diet culture being presented in like today's society or in your life? Advertising weight loss products, yeah. Distribution posts, yes. It's all over the place, right? So keep thinking about that. And so the next term we want to define is decolonization, which is reclaiming what was taken and honoring what we still have. And we have an image here of a fist, which signifies a standing in solidarity or support of a movement. And what decolonization can look like. Does anyone have any ideas? Or we already defined this in the last presentation, which was awesome, but we would like to bring that conversation over here as well.
Maybe I think about questioning our food choices, like in our families. Like, why is it normal for us to have Spam in our cupboards? Is that like a Filipino food, or like where did that come from, for example?
Yeah, that is one great example of how to do that, how to practice decolonization. And so going back to the main question of this slide is, how does BMI influence your thoughts on health and the following terms? So I kind of want to tie in BMI with Americanization by saying that replacing traditional, BMI kind of influences Americanization by replacing traditional foods with processed foods, like someone mentioned Spam, right? BMI and assimilation, we mentioned earlier that if you're assimilating to a sedentary lifestyle, you may increase your BMI because of inactivity. And then it leads to all of the other outcomes. And tying BMI to diet culture, BMI can be seen as the main fueling system of this belief system. And then with decolonization, you can look at BMI by, at a political stance, by challenging BMI and rejecting white supremacy. So yes, and we want to take these thoughts into consideration when we move into our breakout rooms. Do we have any questions so far as we transition into the breakout rooms?
All right, hearing no questions, we're going to go into our breakout rooms where you're going to have a facilitator in each room to just ask some reflecting questions about some of the things that we talked about, and also just to hear from your peers, what are your thoughts? It can bring up a lot of different things, and I think we could have some really awesome, insightful conversations. So we also ask that you could identify a person to report back to the larger group about just some of the things that y'all shared later on. And if Ruby, you could put us in our breakout rooms, that'd be great.
It's all set up. How much?
Yeah, cool. So yeah, the question I wanted to ask everyone, I'll put it in the chat too as well for everyone to see, is what was your experience like growing up with food, culture, and diet?
I can go first. My experience being raised in a first-generation Mexican household was constant chatter on the phone about so-and-so gained weight, so-and-so is this skinny, so-and-so, just always talking about people's weight. I always heard. And I think growing up, I was always like super paranoid about getting criticized. So like I always like would do abs and like work out my abs after eating dinner, like hundreds of abs workouts and shit, just because I was so scared of even gaining a little bit of weight. I played a lot of sports, and it was like a really negative place in my house as far as like being a certain weight and being accepted. And we ate like a lot of tortillas and pozole and like burritos and tacos. So it was just like, I don't know, it was like a weird thing. And you know, there's just like a lot of fat phobia in our culture, and it definitely showed.
I was gonna, in my family, I guess growing up in a Chinese household, it's kind of like for dinner, it's like the staples are like you have a whole bunch of rice, and then you just have a whole bunch of different things that you add onto your plate, your bowl. So I think I was always just used to like just eating a lot, like just eat till you're full. And I think that unfortunately kind of carried over just in life of like I've had to I struggle with portioning down because I'm just so used to just like eating till you're full. Um, but I definitely had this mix of like Americanized culture food and Chinese traditional Chinese food that you don't necessarily see in Chinese restaurants. Just by having the home cooking and having some of that freedom to go out and get some of that other food too. Um, yeah, that was kind of how it was like for me. Diet didn't really exist, but I was also a much more active kid at the time. So weight wasn't a huge concern at the time.
For me, I grew up on a cattle ranch in Canada, and so we ate a lot of meat, just beef, like all the time, and it's really not good for you to eat so much beef all the time. And lots of potatoes, just kind of like the standard American diet, and then also supplemented with like processed stuff like margarine and I don't know, macaroni and cheese from the box and like stuff like that. Especially when, yeah, and yeah, it was just a lot of that stuff. And yeah, didn't not too much talk. I think there's a lot of I think like male privilege around diet. Like that was not something I had to think about as a young person. It wasn't like reinforced in the culture that like I needed to watch what I eat or anything like that. Um, and yeah, whereas like my sister would be more concerned about that kind of stuff and feel that pressure. Um, and then the other thing from my youth is just eating really fast because having a lot of siblings and making sure that you got what you wanted and having to like fight my little brother. Literally, he'd eat off my plate. So that's it. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for sharing about that. I know like everyone has their own unique experience with food and culture and diet, and how um, now that trying to see like what our relationship like is with food. And so I know that Erica kind of briefly touched upon it, talking about, like Americanization and assimilation, and, how BMI is like, rooted in white supremacy. And so the next question I wanted to ask you, and kind of like reflecting what Erica has kind of shared with us, is, what does, decolonize your diet mean to you? And I'll put that in the chat for us to kind of marinate on that question. Yeah, and I just want to also be open and transparent, with whatever we share. There's no right or wrong answer, This is an open space for us to just have a dialogue and explore, like, with all these questions that I have for y'all today.
I can share. Um, yeah, when you pose that question, it kind of makes me think about um, when I was living in Seattle and there's like hella vegans and stuff like that. And They'd always talk about making that diet shift, and then it made me feel really guilty about the food that I ate like growing up, like Filipino food, which is a lot of like meat and like soy sauce and like vinegar and like all that kind of stuff. And I remember like telling my mom like, oh, instead of like a pork adobo, which is just like pork, soy sauce, and like vinegar or whatever. I was like, oh, you should like make tofu or just replace like all the meat in like Filipino food with like vegetables or something like that. And then she was like, what are you talking about? Like, you can't do that. Like, that's so like weird. And then, yeah, I didn't really realize that until like after, I was like asking her to change the way that she cooked and the way that she learned how to cook from her grandparents and generations before. And um, yeah, yeah.
I remember one time my brother came home and he told my mom that he was going to be a vegetarian. And she was like super like confused and like, why? Like, what did I do? And just like, hella sad. And it's just interesting that, my mom, she has such a connection with her food and the dishes she makes for us that it's, it's a very special thing for her.
I grew up with such a weird fusion of influences around food because my dad and stepmom were real into cooking and heavy cream and kind of like Italian food. And then my mom was just kind of like eating whatever she felt was good and sometimes healthy, like comfort food. And then I got really pulled into the vegan movement of Memphis in the 90s and started getting in it with all the zines like Soy Not Oi, Well Fed, Not an Animal Dead. And so I started cooking. But I've always been kind of adherent to, I guess, like the privileged place of like just, I don't know, eating to live and not really, well, I don't really have a culinary, like foodie kind of palate. And then I think of when my dad used to tell me, like, don't work out or try to sculpt your body because that's only what the gays do or something, which was weird homophobia. But decolonizing, I think of that as just like fruits and veggies and local, no factory farming.
I think recently I started to like really dig into what food means to me. And for a long time, I've always associated food with just being bad and like limiting myself. And just because of the way that I grew up, my parents were always not cooking the healthiest meals, but yet would like remind my sister and I that we had to, make sure that we're watching what we eat and how much we ate, but like never really taught us how to do that. And I'm like unlearning all these things and trying my hardest not to associate food with it being bad or good, and instead, you know, making that difference as of what food has more nutrition versus what has less nutrition in it, and then making that switch. And then recently I had a conversation with my mom and telling her, one of the most difficult things about watching what you eat or whatever is not being able to like learn like, I don't know, how like learn how to like cook healthier. So I'm like currently diving into that with my sister too. and hoping that once the semester is over, we can like unlearn all of this and teach each other how to like just have better relationships with food, um, and start there.
Thank you all for sharing. Everything that you all shared was very fruitful. And I'm like absorbing and digesting everything that you all shared. And um, I do want to kind of like wrap it up and have you all think about too, like as we're thinking about decolonizing our diet, like, you know, think about like who is to say that like our food choices are not healthy, you know? Because again, like um, the food that we put in our body, we know that, you know, ties in with our culture, our identity, um, you know, our mind, body, and soul. So I hope you all take in consideration and reflect and think about that, and how today's conversation is not the last conversation that we'll have about this, you know, and I hope you all can take the time to reflect and think about decolonizing our diet from this day forward. And then Antonella, will you feel comfortable sharing with what notes you wrote down for us? All right, thank you so much. Thank you all for engaging in our discussion. I'll see y'all back in the main room.
Thank you. So good.
Yeah. Also, we have trauma from society.
Yes.
Because of telling us how wrong our people's foods are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is everyone back? Yeah. Okay, great. So again, thank you everyone for joining our Food for Thought breakout rooms. I hope you all had some fruitful discussions. Um, can we have one person from each group share just some of what they discussed? Just some thoughts.
Yeah, I'll go. So my group was discussing a lot. I mean, it brought up a lot of memories, I think, for all of us. How, you know, in a lot of like Latinx communities, um, we often can't stop talking about each other's weight. And that's one of like the attention grabbers in all of our like chisme talk. And that there's a lot of like fat phobia in our cultures. You know, some of our cultures are just, you know, abundant with foods that now some of us like struggle with um, portions, and how we also know that there is a lot more pressure on women to like meet these societal standards of being like a certain weight or size, and that how we don't really question so much why we have so much meat in our diet growing up, especially, and how it would have been it would we'd always like, some of us had experience with, you know, our families just cooking a lot of meat, and we would often, you know, ask to replace them with more veggies, um, and then Yaya mentioned something about um, sometimes it's harder to make the switch because we have so much connection with food, and so much food appreciation that maybe doing the switch kind of feels like we're being disconnected from it. Um, and yeah, pretty much it.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think it was so important too, the way that y'all brought up, you know, the influence of like societal norms on like gender, and gender expression, and you know, thinking about like how that is also, you know, a product of colonization, right? Like standards of beauty and how that gets tied into what we eat. So thank you for sharing. Um, Another group want to go?
I can go.
Thanks.
A theme that came up a lot for us was how we are influenced externally in our views of diet and bodies. So whether that's from our own family members or other dominant cultures around us, or like people in power like medical providers, how there's a lot of different kind of contradicting forces pulling on us, and it's really hard to sort out who to listen to and what it all means.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, like you said, there's so many systems, right? Pulling at us. And right, I see your chat, Zach, medical providers, right? Which also says so much as we go into our public health profession and thinking about like our last group, what does it mean to think in a decolonized sort of framework as we go into this profession? Any other group want to go? I think we have two others.
I can share what was discussed in our breakout room. So,
Thanks,
on multi-directional themes, ranging from stigma to what's the perception of being healthy, human worthiness in terms of going to a supermarket in the upper crust neighborhood versus like relying on food stamps to get the needed food, and food systems, which I brought up with reflecting with where our food comes from. Like my most favorite dish, the pinakbet. Like I would like to thank the farmers for growing the vegetables, and also the importance of giving grace and having the moderation to eat, but at the same time preserving like your individuality and your culture.
Thanks, Eleanor. Yeah, the whole part about, giving yourself grace too, and like caring for yourself and eating however you want to eat also is a way of decolonizing, right? From this larger institution of saying, of like fat phobia or shaming. So thanks, Eleanor. And last group. Or was that all the groups? All right. Well, okay. So I think that was all the groups. So I just want to say again, thank you for sharing. It really sounded like y'all had some really insightful conversations that may have also left some lingering thoughts. So I'm going to drop in a link for Jamboard here on the chat and ask that you drop in a word or phrase of some of your main takeaways, something that stood out to you, or something that you're left still thinking about. And we'll take just a few moments to go ahead and do that. So I see food is a way of connection to self and ancestors. Love it. Feeling seen and understood. Proud of my roots and diet. Yes. Enjoy what you eat moderately and savor every piece with enthusiasm and a happy heart. Absolutely. Food as sustenance. Unlearning toxic minds and behaviors. Absolutely. Me hungry too. Body liberation. Yes. Makes me want to figure out what my great grandparents ate. Talking about the decolonizing brought back horrible memories of my life. I'm so sorry. I definitely want to say that, we should have prefaced with some content warning, and we definitely, appreciate that feedback, and we'll incorporate that in any future workshop. Thank you. weight inclusive model is one we might promote among healthcare providers. Need to re-experience food to make positive associations. Awesome. Well, we're gonna just leave this up here for y'all to look at, and you can continue to add, but just wanted to say again, thank you so much. And we just wanted to leave you, you know, if you're interested in diving deeper into some of these topics, we have some resources here for you. We have Food Justice, which is a great book by Robert Gottlieb and Anupama Joshi. A TV series called Counterspace with Chef Sophia Rowe on Vice TV, an article by Tamara Melton on how healthy eating can exclude cultures, and also a podcast called Edible Activist from Washington, D.C. And so again, thank you for joining us and reflecting on a topic that we can all really continuously learn and grow in. Thanks.